The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1887, carried by trembling fingers that had memorized every word by touch. Sarah Mitchell sat by her small window in the Boston tenement, listening to the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages while her fingertips traced the raised dots of Braille she had painstakingly learned. The correspondence from Thomas Garrett of Cedar Falls, Colorado promised partnership, companionship, and a life far from the suffocating charity of distant relatives, who saw her blindness as nothing more than a burden to bear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had lost her sight at 12 to scarlet fever, but she had never lost her dreams. While other women her age focused on finding suitable husbands through proper introductions and chaperoned dances, Sarah had taught herself to navigate the world through sound and touch. She could identify a person's mood by the rhythm of their footsteps, could tell the quality of fabric by running it between her fingers, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense the layout of rooms simply by listening to how sound bounced off walls and furniture. Her fingers were magic with thread and needle, creating intricate embroidery that amazed everyone who saw it, though they always seemed shocked that someone who couldn't see could create such beauty. The letters from Thomas had been kind, practical, and refreshingly honest about frontier life. He needed a wife who could manage a household, help with the endless tasks of ranch life, and provide companionship during the long Colorado winters. Sarah had been equally forthright about her condition, explaining that while she couldn't see, she was fully capable of cooking, cleaning, sewing, and managing domestic affairs. His response had been encouraging, even enthusiastic, speaking of how her other senses might actually be advantages in the wilderness, where hearing approaching storms or sensing changes in animal behavior could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Now, with her meager possessions packed into a single leather satchel and her most precious belonging, her mother's silver thimble tucked safely in her coat pocket, Sarah prepared for the journey that would change everything. She had sold the few items of value she possessed, including her grandmother's pearl brooch, to afford the train ticket west. The money her relatives had grudgingly provided for her keep would last exactly long enough to reach Colorado, with nothing left for a return journey should things go wrong. The train's whistle cut through the crisp mountain air as it pulled into Cedar Falls Station, a sound Sarah had been anticipating for nearly a week of travel. She gathered her satchel and the worn carpet bag that contained everything she owned, feeling for the small piece of paper where she had carefully written Thomas Garrett's name in her neat, measured handwriting. The conductor's gentle hand on her elbow guided her down the steep steps onto the wooden platform, where the thin Colorado air immediately filled her lungs with the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Cedar Falls was smaller than she had imagined, based on Thomas's descriptions in his letters. The sounds were different from Boston, more spread out, with the echo of voices bouncing off wooden buildings rather than brick and stone. She could hear the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, and somewhere nearby, the rhythmic hammering of what must be the blacksmith's shop. The mountains that Thomas had written about so eloquently were invisible to her, but she could feel their presence in the way sound seemed to be contained, bouncing back from unseen heights that surrounded the valley. Standing on the platform with her bags at her feet, Sarah listened carefully to identify the approaching footsteps that might belong to her intended husband. Several sets of boots moved past her, some pausing briefly before continuing on their way. She heard a woman's voice directing children, a man discussing the price of grain with another, and the station master calling out departure times for the next eastbound train. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the platform gradually emptied, leaving Sarah increasingly alone with her growing anxiety. Finally, heavy footsteps approached with purpose, stopping directly in front of her. The man's breathing was slightly labored, as if he had been hurrying, and she caught the scent of leather and horses that she associated with ranch work. This had to be Thomas Garrett, though something in his hesitation made her stomach clench with an unfamiliar dread. "Miss Mitchell!" The voice was deeper than she had expected, with a roughness that suggested a man not accustomed to gentle conversation. "Yes, Mr. Garrett, I presume." Sarah turned her face toward the sound, offering the warm smile that had always been her way of putting others at ease. "I'm so pleased to finally meet you after all our correspondence." The silence that followed lasted just a moment too long. Sarah felt her smile waver as she sensed something wrong in his posture, in the way his breathing had changed. She had become expert at reading the subtle signs that sighted people thought they could hide, and everything about Thomas Garrett's presence suggested shock, disappointment, and something approaching panic. "You didn't mention in your letters that you were..." He paused, clearly struggling with the words. "That your condition was so obvious." Sarah's heart began to sink as understanding washed over her. In her letters, she had been clear about her blindness, but she realized now that Thomas might not have fully comprehended what that meant. Perhaps he had imagined someone with partial sight, or had convinced himself that her condition would be barely noticeable. The reality of her unfocused gaze, the way she held her head tilted slightly to better catch sounds, the careful way she moved her hands to orient herself, all of this was apparently not what he had envisioned. "Mr. Garrett," she said carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach, "I was very clear in my letters about my blindness. I explained that I lost my sight as a child, but that I'm fully capable of managing household duties and..." "I know what you wrote," he interrupted, his tone growing harder, "but I expected..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Sarah stood straighter, drawing on the dignity that had carried her through years of navigating a world designed for the sighted. "What exactly did you expect, Mr. Garrett?" Another long pause. In the silence, Sarah could hear a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the sound of a door slamming, and the whisper of wind through what must be the pine trees that surrounded the town. These were the sounds of the place she had hoped would become her home, but they now seemed to mock her growing realization that she was not welcome here. "I expected someone who could be a proper ranch wife," Thomas finally said, his voice tight with what sounded like anger, though Sarah suspected it was really fear. "Someone who could watch for dangers, help with the livestock, see to things that need seeing to. I can't have a wife who's going to be more burden than help." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one carefully calculated to wound. She had faced rejection before, had endured the pitying looks and dismissive attitudes of people who saw her blindness before they saw her, but somehow this felt different. This was supposed to be her new beginning, her chance to prove that she could be a partner and companion despite her lack of sight. Instead, she found herself standing on a train platform in a strange town, being rejected by a man who had never bothered to truly understand what her letters had been telling him. "I see," she said quietly, though her voice carried a strength that surprised even her. "And what exactly do you propose we do now, Mr.?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Garrett, I've traveled nearly 2,000 miles based on your letters and promises." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping against the wooden platform. "I'll pay for your room at the boarding house tonight," he said grudgingly. "And I'll cover your train fare back east tomorrow. That's more than fair, considering the circumstances." Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. More than fair, as if her time, her hopes, her investment in this journey meant nothing. as if she were a piece of damaged goods being returned to the store. She thought of the pearl brooch she had sold, the careful budgeting that had made this trip possible, the letters she had written to Thomas over the past 6 months, sharing her thoughts and dreams and plans for their future together. "How generous of you," she said, and there was no hiding the bitter edge in her voice now. "To pay for one night's lodging for the woman you invited to travel across the country to marry you." Thomas took a step back, perhaps startled by the strength in her tone. "Now see here, Miss Mitchell, I'm trying to do right by you. This isn't anyone's fault. It's just not going to work out." Sarah bent to pick up her bags, her movements precise despite her inability to see. She had learned long ago that showing uncertainty or helplessness in front of people who already doubted her capabilities would only make things worse. "Indeed, Mr. Garrett, it certainly is not going to work out. If you could direct me to this boarding house you mentioned, I'll relieve you of my presence." She heard him mumble something about Mrs. Hayes and directions up Main Street, but Sarah was no longer truly listening. The roaring in her ears was partly anger, partly humiliation, and partly the terrible realization that she was now stranded in a strange town with barely enough money for a few days' lodging and no plan for what came next. The return train ticket Thomas had promised would get her back to Boston, back to the relatives who had made it clear that her presence was a duty rather than a pleasure, back to the small, constrained life she had been so desperate to escape. As Thomas's footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely, Sarah stood alone on the platform, listening to the sounds of Cedar Falls settling into evening. Somewhere a church bell was ringing the hour, dogs were barking their dinner-time chorus, and she could hear the distant sound of laughter from what must be a saloon or restaurant. These were the sounds of a community, of people going about their lives with purpose and connection, and she had never felt more excluded from that world than she did in this moment. The boarding house Mrs. Hayes ran turned out to be a 3-story wooden building on Main Street with a front porch that creaked under Sarah's careful footsteps and a door that opened before she could even knock. Mrs. Hayes was a woman of perhaps 50, with a voice that suggested kindness tempered by practical experience. She asked no questions about Sarah's circumstances, simply showed her to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor and provided clear directions to the wash basin, the window that faced east toward the mountains, and the dining room where breakfast would be served at 7 sharp. Alone in her room as darkness fell over Cedar Falls, Sarah sat on the edge of the narrow bed and allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She had gambled everything on this chance for a new life, and now she found herself worse off than when she had started. At least in Boston, she had known the streets, had established relationships with shopkeepers who trusted her work, had carved out a small but stable existence. Here, she knew no one, had no connections, and possessed skills that might or might not translate to frontier life. But as she sat in the darkness that was no different to her than the light, Sarah began to feel something else stirring beneath the hurt and disappointment. It was anger, but not the hot, destructive kind. This was the cold, determined anger that had driven her to learn Braille when the doctors said it was too difficult, that had motivated her to master cooking and household management when her relatives assumed she would always need care, that had given her the courage to answer Thomas Garrett's advertisement in the first place. She had not traveled 2,000 miles to give up at the first obstacle. Thomas Garrett's rejection stung, but it also revealed something important about his character that would have made him a poor husband anyway. A man who could not see past her blindness to her capabilities and strength was not worthy of her partnership. She deserved better. And perhaps Cedar Falls held possibilities that had nothing to do with Thomas Garrett and his small-minded vision of what a ranch wife should be. As Sarah unpacked her few belongings and prepared for bed, she made a decision that would change the course of her story. She would not take the first train back to Boston. She would not retreat to the constrained life she had left behind. Instead, she would stay in Cedar Falls long enough to explore what opportunities this mountain town might offer to a woman with her particular combination of skills and determination. She had survived worse than Thomas Garrett's rejection, and she would survive this too. More than survive, she would find a way to thrive, to prove that blindness was not the limitation that narrow-minded people assumed it to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time since stepping off the train, Sarah Mitchell allowed herself to feel something that might eventually grow into hope. Dawn broke over Cedar Falls with the sound of roosters crowing and the distant whistle of the lumber mill starting its daily operations. Sarah woke to unfamiliar sounds filtering through the thin walls of the boarding house, her internal clock telling her it was still early, despite having slept poorly on the narrow mattress. The events of the previous day felt like a nightmare she might wake from, but the scratchy wool blanket and the scent of pine wood smoke confirmed that her rejection by Thomas Garrett had been all too real. Mrs. Hayes proved to be a woman of few words, but considerable warmth. When Sarah made her way carefully down the steep stairs to the dining room, following the banister with practiced caution, she found a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits waiting at a table set for one. The older woman poured coffee that smelled rich and strong, nothing like the weak brew she had grown accustomed to in Boston. "Eat up," Mrs. Hayes said simply. "Mountain air makes everything taste better, but you need fuel to appreciate it properly." Sarah had expected questions about her circumstances, perhaps even curiosity about why a mail-order bride was staying at the boarding house instead of with her intended husband. Instead, Mrs. Hayes seemed content to let her eat in peace, while bustling around the kitchen, cleaning dishes and preparing what sounded like bread dough for the day's baking. "Mrs. Hayes," Sarah finally ventured, setting down her coffee cup with careful precision, "I wonder if you might tell me something about the town. What sorts of businesses operate here? What kind of work might be available for someone with my particular skills?" The older woman's hands stilled in their kneading. "What skills would those be, dear?" "I'm very accomplished with needlework," Sarah said, lifting her chin with quiet pride. "Embroidery, mending, tailoring when needed. I can also manage household accounts, though I keep my records in Braille. I'm an excellent cook when I have a chance to familiarize myself with the kitchen, and I'm quite good with children if any families need help with teaching or care." Mrs. Hayes resumed her kneading, but Sarah could hear something thoughtful in the rhythm. "Cedar Falls isn't a large place," she said slowly. "Most folks do their own mending and such. But," she paused, considering, "Martha Fletcher at the general store might have use for someone handy with a needle. Lots of miners and ranch hands come through needing repairs on their clothes, and Martha's getting on in years. Her fingers aren't what they used to be for close work." Sarah felt the first flutter of genuine hope since arriving in Colorado. "Do you think she might be willing to speak with me?" "Can't hurt to ask. Fletcher's general store is 3 buildings down from here on the same side of the street. Big sign out front, though I suppose that won't help you much." Mrs. Hayes's tone was matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "Sound carries well in this. Thin air. Listen for the bell above the door and the creak of the floorboards. Old building, but solid." After breakfast, Sarah gathered her courage and made her way onto Main Street. Cedar Falls revealed itself to her gradually through sound and scent and the feel of wooden sidewalks under her feet. She could hear the rhythmic hammering from a blacksmith shop, the lowing of cattle from somewhere beyond the town proper, and the voices of men discussing weather and business prospects. The air was crisp and clean in a way that Boston air had never been, carrying scents of pine and wood smoke and something she couldn't identify, but that seemed to speak of vast open spaces. Fletcher's General Store announced itself with the jingle of a brass bell as she pushed open the heavy door. The interior smelled of coffee beans, leather goods, and the particular mustiness of bolted fabric. Sarah paused just inside the doorway, letting her ears map the space. Shelves lined the walls, packed with goods that rustled and clinked as someone moved around behind what must be the main counter. Footsteps approached, lighter than a man's but with the confident stride of someone comfortable in their domain. "Good morning," a woman's voice said, curious but not unwelcoming. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Martha Fletcher." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, offering her most reassuring smile. "Mrs. Hayes at the boarding house suggested you might have need of someone skilled with needlework and mending." A pause, during which Sarah imagined Martha Fletcher taking in her appearance, noting the unfocused gaze and careful posture that marked her as blind. She had learned to wait through these moments, to let people process their initial assumptions before demonstrating her capabilities. "What sort of needlework?" Martha finally asked, her tone neutral. "All kinds. Embroidery, of course, but also practical mending, tailoring, even some leather work if the job calls for it. I brought samples of my work if you'd like to examine them." Sarah reached into her satchel and withdrew a small piece of linen she had embroidered during the long train journey. The design was intricate, a pattern of mountain wildflowers she had created from memory of descriptions in Thomas's letters. Her fingers had worked the silk threads with precision that came from years of practice, creating tiny French knots for flower centers and delicate stem stitches for leaves and petals. She heard Martha's sharp intake of breath as the woman examined the embroidery. "This is remarkable work. You did this without being able to see what you were creating." "I've been doing needlework since I was very young," Sarah explained. "My fingers know the feel of different stitches, the tension needed for various threads. In some ways, I think working by touch gives me advantages a sighted person might not have. I can feel imperfections that might not be immediately visible." Martha was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could hear her moving around the counter, perhaps getting a better look at the embroidery in different light. "I do get requests for mending," she admitted, "especially from the miners and ranch hands. Hard work is tough on clothes, and most of these men don't have wives to keep their things in good repair. But I have to be honest with you, Miss Mitchell. The pay wouldn't be much, and the work might be inconsistent." "I'm not looking for charity," Sarah said firmly. "I'm looking for honest work that I can do well. If you're willing to give me a chance to prove myself, I believe you'll find my work satisfactory." Something in her tone must have convinced Martha Fletcher, because the woman's voice warmed perceptibly. "All right then, there's a room in the back where you could work, has good light from a south-facing window, though I suppose that won't matter to you. I can provide basic supplies to start, and we'll see how things go. I generally charge customers by the complexity of the repair needed." Sarah felt tension she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to ease from her shoulders. "That sounds very fair. When would you like me to start?" "No time like the present. Let me show you the workspace and we can discuss the arrangement in more detail." The back room proved to be a cozy space with a comfortable chair positioned near the window Martha had mentioned. Sarah ran her hands over the work surface, memorizing the layout of drawers and shelves where supplies were kept. Martha explained her system for organizing different types of thread, needles, and fabrics, and Sarah made mental notes about how she would adapt the arrangement to work most efficiently. "There's one thing I should mention," Martha said as they returned to the main store. "People in this town can be and set in their ways. Some folks might have opinions about your condition, might think you can't do the work properly. Don't let that discourage you. I've seen your embroidery, and that tells me everything I need to know about your capabilities." Sarah nodded, appreciating the woman's directness. "I've faced such attitudes before. I find that good work speaks louder than prejudice, given time." Her first customer arrived that very afternoon, a young ranch hand named Jimmy, who had torn a long gash in his only good shirt while wrestling with barbed wire. The repair required careful matching of thread color and a technique that would make the mend as invisible as possible. Sarah worked slowly at first, familiarizing herself with the fabric and the nature of the damage, but her fingers soon found their rhythm. Jimmy watched with undisguised fascination as she worked, asking questions about how she could sew so precisely without seeing the fabric. Sarah answered patiently, explaining how she used the texture of the weave to guide her needle. How different. Threads felt different under her fingertips. How years of practice had taught her to visualize the work through touch alone. "Never seen anything like it," Jimmy marveled as she finished the repair with tiny, nearly invisible stitches. "Looks better than it did before I tore it." Word of the blind seamstress who could work miracles with needle and thread spread through Cedar Falls with the speed that news travels in small communities. By the end of her first week, Sarah had repaired 3 shirts, hemmed a pair of trousers that had been too long for their owner, and even tackled the complex job of mending a leather vest that had been damaged in a mining accident. The work was satisfying in ways that her previous employment in Boston had never been. Each repair presented a unique challenge, and she took pride in finding solutions that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. Martha Fletcher proved to be a fair employer, paying promptly and even increasing Sarah's share of the proceeds when it became clear that customers specifically requested her services. But it was the gradual acceptance by the community that meant the most to Sarah. At first, people came to Fletcher's store out of curiosity, wanting to see the blind woman who could sew with such precision. Some were skeptical, examining her work with obvious doubt before grudgingly admitting its quality. Others were openly amazed, treating her skill as though it was some kind of supernatural ability rather than the result of years of practice and determination. Slowly, however, the novelty wore off, and Sarah began to be seen simply as the woman who could fix what was broken, who could make old clothes serviceable again, who took pride in her craft regardless of the circumstances that had brought her to Cedar Falls. Regular customers began greeting her by name when they encountered her on the street, and Martha Fletcher made it clear that Sarah's position at the store was permanent for as long as she wanted it. Mrs. Hayes at the boarding house also proved to be more than just a landlady. The older woman had a practical wisdom born of years of observing human nature, and she seemed to understand that Sarah needed space to rebuild her confidence after Thomas Garrett's rejection, without being overwhelmed by well-meaning but intrusive sympathy. "You're settling in well," Mrs. Hayes observed one evening as Sarah returned from a particularly busy day at the store. "Martha Fletcher speaks highly of your work, says she's never had anyone who could make repairs so neat and strong." Sarah paused on the front porch, listening to the evening sounds of Cedar Falls. Somewhere a dog was barking, children were playing in a distant yard, and she could hear the faint sound of a harmonica being played with more enthusiasm than skill. These were the sounds of a community at peace with itself, and for the first time since arriving in Colorado, she felt like she might have a place within it. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," she said, "and for your kindness in helping me find my way." Mrs. Hayes made a dismissive sound. "Kindness nothing. Good workers are hard to find, and Martha Fletcher's no fool. She knows quality when she sees it, even if some other folks in this town were too blind to recognize it when it was right in front of them." The pointed reference to Thomas Garrett made Sarah smile despite herself. In the week since their disastrous meeting at the train station, she had seen him only once, driving his wagon through town, with his hat pulled low and his eyes fixed straight ahead. She felt no anger toward him anymore, only a kind of distant pity for a man whose narrow vision had cost him the partnership she would have gladly provided. As autumn deepened and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks surrounding Cedar, Sarah established routines that gave structure and purpose to her days. She woke early, had breakfast with Mrs. Hayes, and walked to Fletcher's store where she spent her mornings working on whatever repairs had accumulated overnight. Afternoons were often spent teaching herself the geography of Cedar Falls, learning the locations of businesses and residences, the safe routes to walk and the obstacles to avoid. The people of Cedar Falls gradually grew accustomed to seeing her navigate their streets with confidence, her keen hearing alerting her to approaching horses or wagons, her careful steps avoiding the worst of the mud and snow that characterized mountain weather. Children, with their natural curiosity, were often the most accepting of her condition, asking direct questions about how she managed daily tasks and expressing amazement at her abilities rather than pity for her limitations. It was during one of these afternoon walks that Sarah first encountered Daniel Cooper, though she wouldn't learn his name until much later. She was making her way back to the boarding house after delivering a repaired coat to Dr. Walsh, when she heard the sound of horses in distress somewhere ahead. The whinnying was high-pitched and frightened, accompanied by a man's voice speaking in low, soothing tones. Sarah paused, her head tilted to better catch the sounds. One of the horses seemed to be favoring a leg, its gait uneven and painful. The man's voice continued, patient and gentle, and she could hear him moving around the animals with careful, deliberate steps. "Easy now, girl," the voice said, so quietly that Sarah had to strain to hear it. "Let's have a look at that hoof. I know it hurts, but we need to see what's wrong." Something in the man's tone, the genuine concern and gentleness, made Sarah want to help. She had grown up around horses before her illness, had learned to read their moods and needs through sound and scent. Moving carefully toward the voices, she called out softly, so as not to startle the already nervous animals. "Excuse me, is everything all right? I heard the horses and wondered if you might need assistance." The man's voice paused in its soothing murmur. "That's kind of you to offer, miss, but I think we'll manage. Just picked up a stone in her hoof, nothing too serious." Sarah moved closer, guided by the sound of his voice and the restless movement of the horses. "I may not be able to see, but I have some experience with horses. Sometimes an extra pair of hands can be helpful, even if they have to work by feel." A longer pause, during which Sarah imagined the man taking in her appearance and making the same calculations that everyone made when they first encountered her. But his voice, when it came again, held curiosity rather than dismissal. "You're the seamstress working at Fletcher's store, aren't you? I've heard good things about your work." "I am." "Sarah Mitchell." She extended her hand in the direction of his voice. "Daniel Cooper. I run the Meadowbrook Ranch about 5 miles south of town." His handshake was firm and brief, his palm rough with the calluses of hard work. "If you're willing to help, I'd be grateful. This mare's been skittish all day, and I think she'd benefit from a calm voice while I work on her hoof." Sarah moved to the horse's head, letting the animal catch her scent before reaching out to stroke the velvet nose. The mare whickered softly, and Sarah began speaking to her in the same low, soothing tone she remembered from her childhood. Her hands found the halter, and she positioned herself where she could keep the horse calm while Daniel worked. "There's a good girl," she murmured, running her hands along the horse's neck and feeling the tension gradually ease from the powerful muscles. "Just let the man help you, and you'll feel much better." Daniel worked with quiet efficiency, his movements confident but gentle as he cleaned the stone from the mare's hoof and checked for any signs of damage. Sarah could hear the care in the way he handled the animal, the patience he showed when the mare flinched or tried to pull away. "That should do it," he said finally, lowering the horse's leg and stepping back. "Thank you for the help. She's usually not so nervous, but something spooked her earlier, and she's been on edge ever since." Horses are sensitive creatures, Sarah observed, still stroking the mare's neck. They pick up on things we might miss, changes in the weather or the presence of predators. Sometimes they know trouble is coming before we do. Daniel's voice carried a note of surprise. You do know horses. Most folks think they're just big, dumb animals, good for pulling wagons and carrying riders. Sarah smiled. I grew up around them before I lost my sight. My father had a small stable, and I spent more time in the barn than in the house when I was young. Horses don't care if you can see them or not. They care about how you treat them and whether you understand their nature. That's remarkably true, Daniel said, and Sarah could hear genuine respect in his voice. Most people never figure that out, even the ones who work with horses every day. As Daniel prepared to mount his horse for the ride back to his ranch, Sarah felt an unexpected reluctance to end the conversation. There had been something refreshing about talking to someone who seemed more interested in her knowledge and abilities than in the fact that she couldn't see. Daniel Cooper had treated her as a partner in solving a problem rather than as an object of curiosity or pity. Mr. Cooper, she said as he gathered the reins, if you ever have need of someone to help with horses or any other ranch work that doesn't require sight, I hope you'll keep me in mind. I may be working as a seamstress now, but I haven't forgotten everything I learned in my father's stable. Daniel paused, and Sarah could sense him studying her face in the growing twilight. I'll remember that, Miss Mitchell. And thank you again for the help today. Not many people would have stopped to offer assistance to a stranger. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Sarah stood alone on the muddy street, feeling something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Cedar Falls. For the first time since Thomas Garrett's rejection, she had encountered someone who saw her as a capable person first and a blind woman second. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, because it reminded her of dreams she had thought she'd given up forever. The encounter with Daniel Cooper lingered in Sarah's mind. As the days grew shorter and the mountain air carried the promise of serious winter weather, she found herself listening for the sound of his voice when she walked through town, wondering if she might encounter him again during one of his trips to Cedar Falls for supplies. The rational part of her mind warned against building fantasies around a single kind interaction, but she couldn't quite suppress the hope that their paths might cross again under similarly pleasant circumstances. That opportunity came sooner than expected, though under circumstances that were far from pleasant. Sarah was working late at Fletcher's store one evening, taking advantage of the quiet hours to tackle a particularly complex mending job when she heard commotion in the street outside. Voices were raised in concern, and she could hear the rapid approach of multiple horses being ridden hard. Setting down her needlework, Sarah moved to the front window of the store, though she could see nothing through the glass. The sounds outside painted a clear picture of some kind of emergency. Men were shouting instructions to each other. Horses were snorting and stamping from hard riding, and underneath it all she could hear something that made her blood run cold. The labored breathing and occasional moans of someone in serious pain. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her shawl and hurried outside into the cold evening air. The scene revealed itself to her through sound and scent. A group of men clustered around someone lying in the back of a wagon, their voices tight with worry and the metallic smell of blood sharp in the crisp air. "Get Doc Walsh," someone was saying. "Hurry up before he bleeds out entirely." "Doc's not in town," another voice replied. "Rode out to the Morrison place this afternoon to deliver a baby. Won't be back until tomorrow at the earliest." Sarah moved closer to the wagon, her heart racing as she recognized one of the voices belonging to the injured man. Daniel Cooper was lying in the wagon bed, his breathing shallow and pained, while the men around him argued about what to do in the absence of the town doctor. "Let me through," Sarah said firmly, pushing past the circle of worried men to reach the wagon. The smell of blood was stronger here, mixed with the scent of torn fabric and the fierce sweat of injured flesh. What happened to him? "Miss Mitchell, you shouldn't be here," one of the men protested. "This ain't no sight for a lady, especially not one who—" He trailed off, apparently realizing the irony of his words. "Especially not one who can't. See?" Sarah finished crisply. "Perhaps that's exactly what's needed right now. I can't be shocked by the sight of blood, can I?" She placed her hands on the edge of the wagon, feeling for Daniel's position. "What happened?" "Cougar attack," another voice supplied. "Dan was checking his cattle in the north pasture when it came out of nowhere. Horse threw him right into a patch of deadfall. Then the cat got its claws into his shoulder and arm before he could get his rifle up." Sarah's hands found Daniel's body, and she began a careful assessment of his injuries by touch. His shirt was torn and soaked with blood, and she could feel the deep gouges the cougar's claws had left in his shoulder and upper arm. His breathing was labored but steady, and his pulse, while fast, was strong enough to give her hope. "We need to get him somewhere with better light and clean water," she said, her voice taking on the authority of someone who knew what she was doing. "Mrs. Hayes has a large kitchen table and keeps her house cleaner than most. Can you carry him there?" "But miss, without Doc Walsh," one of the men began uncertainly. "Without Doc Walsh, this man will bleed to death while we stand here debating," Sarah said sharply. "I've tended injuries before, and I know enough about healing to keep him alive until the doctor returns. Now, are you going to help me save his life? Or are you going to let him die while you worry about proprieties?" The men exchanged glances that Sarah couldn't see but could sense in their hesitant movements. Finally, the one who seemed to be their leader spoke up. "All right, miss, but if something goes wrong..." "If something goes wrong because we act..." "That's one thing," Sarah replied, already moving toward the boarding house. "If something goes wrong because we did nothing, that's another entirely." Mrs. Hayes took one look at the procession heading toward her front door and immediately began clearing her kitchen table, setting water to boil and gathering clean towels and sheets. The older woman had seen her share of injuries over the years, and she worked with the efficiency of someone who understood that time was critical. "Set him down gently," Sarah directed as the men carried Daniel into the kitchen. "Mrs. Hayes, I'll need the sharpest knife you have. Clean as you can make it, and all the clean cloth we can find for bandages." As the men laid Daniel on the table, Sarah began cutting away his torn shirt to get a better sense of his injuries. The cougar's claws had left 4 parallel gashes across his shoulder and down his upper arm, deep enough to require stitching, but thankfully not deep enough to have severed any major arteries. His greatest danger was blood loss and the possibility of infection. "This is going to hurt," she murmured to Daniel, though she wasn't sure if he was conscious enough to hear her. "But I need to clean these wounds before I can stitch them." Working by touch, Sarah cleaned each gash thoroughly, using water that Mrs. Hayes kept heating and replacing as it became contaminated. Daniel moaned and stirred as she worked, which she took as a good sign that he wasn't slipping too deeply into shock. The men who had brought him watched in fascination and growing respect as she worked with calm precision, her fingers reading the extent of each injury and determining the best approach for treatment. "How do you know what you're doing?" one of them asked, as Sarah began the delicate work of stitching the deepest of the gashes. "My mother was a midwife before she married my father," Sarah explained, her attention focused on keeping her stitches small and even. "She taught me the basics of wound care and healing herbs. After I lost my sight, I spent time with a doctor in Boston who believed that my enhanced sense of touch might make me particularly good at certain types of medical work." The stitching took nearly 2 hours, with Sarah working by the light of every lamp and candle Mrs. Hayes could provide, though the light was for the benefit of the watching men rather than for Sarah herself. Her fingers could feel the edges of torn flesh, could sense when the stitches were too tight or too loose, could detect the subtle signs that told her when a wound was properly closed. As she worked, Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering incoherently, and other times lying still enough that Sarah had to pause to check his pulse and breathing. During one of his more lucid moments, his eyes opened, and he seemed to focus on her face, bending over him in the lamplight. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with pain and confusion. "I'm here," she said gently, pausing in her stitching to touch his uninjured hand. "You're going to be fine, but you need to lie still and let me finish this." Shouldn't you be afraid, blood and all?" Sarah smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "Mr. Cooper, I may not be able to see blood, but I can certainly smell it, and I've been smelling it for the past 2 hours. If I were going to faint, I would have done it already." A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's pale face before exhaustion claimed him again. Sarah continued her work, binding the stitched wounds with clean bandages and checking his other injuries for signs of damage she might have missed. Besides the claw marks, he had several deep bruises from his fall and a knot on his head that concerned her, but nothing that seemed immediately life-threatening. By the time she finished, dawn was beginning to lighten the windows of Mrs. Hayes's kitchen. The men who had brought Daniel had long since departed, confident that he was in capable hands, and Mrs. Hayes had prepared a bed in her front parlor where the injured man could rest without having to climb stairs. "You did good work tonight," Mrs. Hayes said quietly as they moved Daniel to the makeshift sick room. "I've seen plenty of doctoring in my time, and yours was as neat and thorough as any I've witnessed." Sarah felt a deep weariness settling over her as the immediate crisis passed. "I hope it's enough. Those wounds were deep, and there's always the risk of infection." "We'll watch for fever and keep the wounds clean," Mrs. Hayes assured her. "And Doc Walsh should be back by this evening. He'll want to examine your work, but I suspect he'll be impressed." Indeed, when Dr. Walsh returned to Cedar Falls that evening and examined Daniel's injuries, his first words were of amazement at the quality of the medical care the rancher had received. "Whoever did this stitching has a remarkable touch," he told Mrs. Hayes. "The wounds are clean, the stitches are perfectly even, and there's no sign of infection setting in. It's as good as I could have done myself, perhaps better." When he learned that Sarah had performed the emergency surgery, Dr. Walsh insisted on meeting with her immediately. He was a man in his 60s with graying hair and the gentle manner of someone who had spent decades tending to the ailments and injuries of frontier life. His examination of Sarah's work was thorough and professional, and his questions about her training and experience were searching but respectful. "Miss Mitchell," he said finally, "I wonder if you would consider working with me on a regular basis. Cedar Falls has been growing, and I find myself increasingly unable to handle all the medical needs of this community alone. Your skills with wound care and your enhanced tactile abilities could be invaluable, particularly in situations where precise work is required." Sarah felt her heart leap at the offer. Medical work had always interested her more than sewing, though she had never imagined it might be possible for someone with her condition to pursue such a career. "I would be honored to work with you, Dr. Walsh, though I should mention that I have commitments to Mrs. Fletcher at the general store. I'm sure Martha will understand the importance of having adequate medical care available in our community," Dr. Walsh replied. "Perhaps we can work out an arrangement that allows you to continue your needlework while also assisting me when medical emergencies arise." Over the following days, as Daniel recovered from his injuries, Sarah found herself spending more and more time at Mrs. Hayes's boarding house, helping to care for the injured rancher and learning more about medical procedures from Dr. Walsh's frequent visits. Daniel proved to be a patient who followed instructions, though he chafed at being confined to bed when there was work to be done at his ranch. My foreman can handle things for a few days, he told Sarah during one of her visits to check his bandages. But cattle don't take care of themselves, and there's winter preparations that need to be finished before the heavy snows come. Your cattle will have to manage without you until these wounds heal properly, Sarah replied firmly, testing the skin around his stitches for signs of infection. If you tear these open by trying to do too much too soon, you'll be laid up for weeks instead of days. Daniel submitted to her ministrations with good grace, though Sarah could sense his frustration at being forced into inactivity. As his strength returned, their conversations grew longer and more wide-ranging. He told her about his ranch, about the challenges of raising cattle in the harsh mountain environment, about his plans for expanding his herd and improving his grazing land. Sarah found herself sharing more about her own life than she had with anyone since arriving in Cedar Falls. She told him about growing up in her father's stable, about the illness that had cost her sight, about her struggles to find her place in a world that often saw her disability before it saw her abilities. Thomas Garrett was a fool, Daniel said bluntly when she mentioned her original reason for coming to Colorado. A man who can't see past the surface to what really matters doesn't deserve a woman of your caliber. The warmth in his voice made Sarah's cheeks flush with something that had nothing to do with the heat from Mrs. Hayes's kitchen stove. You're very kind to say so. I'm not being kind, I'm being honest, Daniel replied. I've watched you work, Sarah. I've seen how you handle horses, how you saved my life with nothing but your hands and your knowledge, how you've made a place for yourself in this town through sheer determination. Any man who couldn't appreciate those qualities would be blind in the ways that truly matter. The irony of his words wasn't lost on either of them, and after a moment of surprised silence, they both began to laugh. It was the first time Sarah had laughed with genuine joy since arriving in Cedar Falls, and the sound seemed to surprise her as much as it delighted Daniel. As Daniel's recovery progressed, he began to describe the world outside Mrs. Hayes's parlor to Sarah in ways that painted vivid pictures in her mind. He told her about the way morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls, about the changing colors of aspen leaves as autumn deepened toward winter, about the particular quality of light that preceded snowfall in the mountains. I wish I could show you my ranch, he said one afternoon as Sarah changed his bandages. The view from my front porch takes in the whole valley, and in the evening when the sun is setting behind the western peaks, the entire landscape looks like it's been painted with gold and purple. Describe it to me, Sarah said, settling into the chair beside his bed. I may not be able to see it, but I can imagine it if you give me the details. Daniel's descriptions were so vivid and detailed that Sarah could almost see the ranch. He was painting for her with words. He told her about the log house he had built with his own hands, about the barn that housed his horses and the corrals where he worked with cattle, about the creek that ran through his property and the meadows where wildflowers bloomed in the spring. It sounds beautiful, Sarah said when he finished, and it sounds like a place where someone could build a good life. It could be, Daniel agreed quietly. With the right partner, it could be everything a person might want. The conversation hung between them, weighted with implications that neither was quite ready to voice directly. Sarah felt her heart beating faster as she sensed the direction Daniel's thoughts were taking, but she also felt the familiar fear that came with allowing herself to hope for something that might be too good to be true. Dr. Walsh pronounced Daniel fit to return to his ranch after a week of recovery, though he cautioned against heavy lifting or strenuous activity until the wounds had fully healed. On the morning of his departure, Daniel asked to speak with Sarah privately, and they walked slowly to the front porch of the boarding house where they could talk without being overheard. Sarah, he began, then stopped, apparently struggling with how to express what was on his mind. I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done. You saved my life, and I won't forget that. Anyone with medical knowledge would have done the same, Sarah replied. though she felt there was more he wanted to say. Maybe, but not anyone could have done it as well as you did. And not anyone would have sat with me hour after hour, describing books and sharing stories and making me forget how much everything hurt. Daniel paused, and Sarah could sense him gathering his courage for something important. I know we haven't known each other long, and I know your experiences with men in this territory haven't been entirely positive. But I want you to know that if you ever decide you'd like to see my ranch, to see if it might be a place where you could be happy, you would be more than welcome. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The invitation was carefully worded, offering her a choice without pressure, but the meaning behind it was clear enough. Daniel Cooper was offering her the possibility of the partnership she had originally come to Colorado seeking. But he was offering it in a way that respected her independence and acknowledged her right to make her own decisions. "That's very generous of you," she managed to say. "I would like that very much when the time is right." Daniel's relief was audible in his voice. "Good. I'll be back in town in a week." The morning frost crunched beneath Sarah's boots as she made her way to Fletcher's general store, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. 2 weeks had passed since Daniel Cooper's departure from the boarding house, and during that time, Sarah had found herself thinking about his invitation with increasing frequency. The idea of visiting his ranch both thrilled and terrified her, in equal measure, representing as it did the possibility of a future she had barely dared to imagine. Martha Fletcher noticed the change in her young employee immediately. Sarah's usual focused attention to her needlework was interrupted by moments of distracted contemplation, and more than once, Martha had to repeat questions before receiving an answer. "You've got something on your mind," Martha observed as Sarah worked on hemming a dress for the banker's wife. "Something more significant than whether to use silk thread or cotton for this particular seam." Sarah's hands stilled in their work. She had grown fond of Martha Fletcher over the weeks of their association, appreciating the older woman's direct manner and practical wisdom. If anyone in Cedar Falls could offer sound advice about matters of the heart, it would be Martha. "I've received an invitation," Sarah said carefully, "to visit someone's ranch to see if it might be a place where I could find happiness." Martha's knowing chuckle filled the back room of the store. "Daniel Cooper, I'd wager. The whole town's been talking about how he's been asking everyone who listen about your favorite foods, what kinds of books you enjoy, whether you've ever expressed interest in ranch life." Sarah felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. "He's been asking about me. Honey, that man's been smitten since the day you helped him with his injured horse. The fact that you saved his life just sealed the matter as far as he's concerned." Martha's voice gentled. "The question is, how do you feel about him?" It was a question Sarah had been asking herself repeatedly, and the answer both surprised and frightened her with its clarity. During the hours she had spent caring for Daniel's injuries, listening to his stories and sharing her own, something had grown between them that felt deeper and more genuine than anything she had experienced before. Unlike Thomas Garrett, who had seen only her limitations, Daniel seemed to value her strengths and accept her blindness as simply one aspect of who she was, rather than a defining characteristic. "I think I care for him more than I should, given how little time we've actually spent together," Sarah admitted. "But I'm afraid of making another mistake, of letting hope cloud my judgment again." Martha set down the fabric she had been sorting and moved closer to Sarah's workstation. "Can I tell you something about Daniel Cooper? He's been coming to this store for supplies for nearly 5 years now, ever since he established his ranch. In all that time, I've never seen him show more than polite interest in any of the eligible women in this area. He's courteous and respectful, but distant until you." Sarah's needle paused in mid-stitch. "What do you mean?" I mean, that man lit up like a Christmas tree the first time he walked into this store and saw you working at that table. And when word got around town that you'd patched him up after that cougar attack, he couldn't stop talking about your skill and your courage. That's not the behavior of a man who's looking for any convenient wife, Sarah. That's the behavior of a man who's found someone special. The words warmed Sarah in ways that had nothing to do with the heated store. Still, the memory of Thomas Garrett's rejection lingered, making her cautious about trusting her own judgment when it came to men's intentions. But what if I'm wrong again? What if I visit his ranch and discover that he's not the man I think he is, or that ranch life isn't something I can manage without sight? Martha's laugh was rich and reassuring. Then you'll come back to town, and you'll know that you tried. But Sarah, what if you're right? What if Daniel Cooper is exactly the kind of man who could make you happy? And what if his ranch could become the home you've been looking for? Are you going to let fear of what might go wrong keep you from discovering what might go right? That afternoon, as Sarah walked back to the boarding house, she made her decision. The worst that could happen was another rejection, another disappointment, to add to her collection. But the best that could happen was the life she had dreamed of when she first stepped off the train in Cedar Falls. A life built with someone who valued her for who she was, rather than despite what she couldn't do. Mrs. Hayes listened to Sarah's plans with the satisfied air of someone who had seen this development coming from miles away. "About time," she said briskly. "That Cooper boy's been mooning around town like a lovesick calf ever since he got back on his feet. If you hadn't made a move soon, I was planning to interfere myself." "You were planning to interfere?" Sarah asked, amused despite her nervousness. "Honey, I've been running this boarding house for 15 years. I've seen plenty of people too scared of their own shadows to reach for happiness when it's right in front of them. Sometimes they need a little push in the right direction." Mrs. Hayes's voice softened. "Daniel Cooper's a good man, Sarah. He's worked hard to build something worthwhile out here, and he's got the patience and kindness to appreciate what you bring to a partnership. But more than that, he sees you, really sees you in all the ways that matter." The next morning, Sarah sent word to Daniel through Ben Fletcher that she would be honored to accept his invitation to visit Meadowbrook Ranch. The response came back before noon, carried by one of Daniel's ranch hands, along with an invitation to Sunday dinner and a promise that Daniel would personally escort her to and from the ranch to ensure her comfort and safety. Sunday dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that only seemed to exist in the mountains. Sarah dressed carefully in her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and wrapped herself in the warm cloak Mrs. Hayes had insisted on lending her for the journey. When Daniel arrived at the boarding house driving his wagon, she could hear the smile in his voice as he greeted her. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm to help her up onto the wagon seat. "I hope you're ready for a bit of a ride. It's about an hour to the ranch, but the road's in good condition and the scenery's worth the trip." As they left Cedar Falls behind and began climbing into the foothills, Daniel became Sarah's eyes, describing the landscape that unfolded around them with the same vivid detail he had used during his recovery. He told her about the stands of aspen trees that lined the road, their leaves a brilliant yellow gold against the dark green of the evergreens. He described the way the mountains rose on either side of the valley, their peaks already white with early snow, and the clear stream that paralleled their route, its water so pure that it reflected the sky like a mirror. "There's a family of deer drinking at the stream about 50 yards ahead," he said softly, slowing the wagon so as not to startle them. "A doe and 2 fawns, probably born this past spring. They're watching us, but they don't seem afraid." Sarah tilted her head, listening for the sounds of the deer, and was rewarded with the soft splash of water and the gentle rustle of movement in the underbrush. "They're beautiful creatures," she said. "I used to love watching them when I was young. The way they moved so gracefully, always alert but never seeming anxious." That's exactly right," Daniel agreed, his voice warm with pleasure at her understanding. "Most people see them as skittish, but I think they're just careful. There's a difference between being afraid and being prudent." The comment seemed to apply to more than just deer, and Sarah felt it settle into her thoughts as they continued their journey. She was being prudent, not fearful, in taking this chance on Daniel Cooper and the life he might offer. There was wisdom in careful observation before making important decisions. Meadowbrook Ranch announced itself long before they reached the main buildings, through the lowing of cattle in distant pastures and the scent of hay and horses that spoke of a working operation. As Daniel guided the wagon up the final approach to his home, Sarah could hear the confidence in his voice as he described the property he had built with his own hands. "The house sits on a small rise," he explained, "with the barn and corrals down the slope to the east. The main pastures stretch out to the south and west, with the best grazing near the creek that runs through the property. I've got about 200 head of cattle now, and horses for working them, plus a few extras for riding." The wagon came to a stop, and Daniel helped Sarah down with careful attention to her balance and comfort. The first thing that struck her about Meadowbrook Ranch was the sense of order and purpose that permeated the place. She could hear the sounds of well-maintained equipment, animals that were clearly healthy and content, and the kind of organized activity that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. "Welcome to my home," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of nervous hope. "I know it's not much compared to what you might be used to in the city, but it's built to last, and it's got everything a family might need." Sarah reached out to touch the porch railing, feeling the smooth finish of wood that had been carefully maintained and the solid construction underneath. "It feels substantial," she said, "like something built by someone who intended to stay." Daniel's pleased chuckle told her that her comment had hit its mark. "That was exactly my intention. I didn't come to Colorado to get rich quick and move on. I came to build something that would last, something I could be proud of." The tour of the ranch that followed was a revelation for Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. Daniel's descriptions brought the property to life in her imagination, but it was her other senses that told her the real story of Meadowbrook Ranch. The sounds of healthy animals, the scents of well-cured hay and properly maintained leather, the feel of solid construction and careful maintenance all spoke of a man who understood that success came through attention to detail and consistent effort. In the barn, Daniel introduced her to his horses, each one responding to his voice with the kind of trust that came from fair treatment and consistent care. Sarah ran her hands over their coats, feeling the sleek health that indicated good feeding and grooming, and listened to the quiet contentment in their breathing. "This is Belle," Daniel said, guiding Sarah's hand to the neck of a mare that whickered softly at her touch. "She's the one you helped me with that day in town. I think she remembers you." Indeed, Belle seemed to recognize Sarah, nuzzling her hand and standing quietly as Sarah explored the horse's conformation with gentle touches. "She's a beautiful animal," Sarah said. "Strong but not coarse, with good bone and muscle. You've trained her well." "She came to me half wild and scared of everything," Daniel explained. "Took months of patient work to gain her trust, but it was worth the effort. Now she's one of the best cattle horses I've ever worked with." The parallel wasn't lost on Sarah, and she felt her heart warm at the thought that Daniel might see her own journey from fearful newcomer to confident member of the Cedar Falls community in similar terms. Like Belle, she had needed time and patient understanding to overcome the wariness that came from past hurt. The house itself proved to be exactly what Daniel had promised: substantial without being pretentious, comfortable without being luxurious. Sarah's hands mapped the layout of rooms designed for practical living, noting the wide doorways that would make navigation easier for someone without sight, the sensible placement of furniture, and the attention to details that would matter to someone managing a household. "I built it with the hope that someday I'd share it with a wife and children," Daniel admitted, as he showed her the kitchen with its large windows and efficient layout. "I may have been optimistic about the size, but I wanted room to grow." The kitchen was clearly the work of someone who understood cooking and the importance of good workspace. Sarah ran her hands over the smooth wooden counters, tested the height of the work surfaces, and noted the logical arrangement of storage and preparation areas. "This is beautifully designed," she said. "Whoever planned this kitchen understood that cooking is work that deserves respect and proper tools." "I spent a lot of time watching my mother work in her kitchen when I was growing up," Daniel explained. "She always complained about having to work around poor planning and inadequate space, so I tried to remember her suggestions when I was building this place." Lunch was served on Daniel's front porch, where they could enjoy the warm October sunshine. While taking in the panoramic view of the valley, Daniel had clearly put considerable thought into the meal, preparing foods that would showcase the ranch's bounty while being easy for Sarah to manage without sight. There was fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter churned from his own cow's cream, eggs from his chickens prepared exactly as she preferred them, and coffee that tasted better than anything she had experienced since leaving Boston. As they ate, Daniel continued his role as Sarah's eyes, describing the view from the porch in detail that painted vivid pictures in her mind. He told her about the way the afternoon light played across the distant mountains, about the patterns of shadow and sunlight that moved across the valley floor, about the way the cattle looked like toy animals from this distance as they grazed in the far pastures. "I can see why you love this place," Sarah said, setting down her coffee cup and turning her face toward the warmth of the sun. "There's a peace here that I haven't felt since I was very young. It feels like a place where someone could put down roots and grow." Daniel's voice was quiet when he responded. "Sarah, I want you to know that if you ever decided this could be your home too, you would have complete freedom to make whatever changes you felt were necessary. The house, the arrangements, everything could be adapted to make your life easier and more comfortable." The offer was generous and thoughtful, but Sarah heard something else in Daniel's words that meant even more to her. He wasn't asking her to fit into his existing life unchanged. He was offering to reshape that life to accommodate her needs and preferences. It was the kind of partnership she had dreamed of, but never quite dared to expect. "That's very thoughtful of you," she said carefully. "But I wouldn't want you to feel that you had to change everything about your life to make room for me." "Sarah," Daniel said, his voice carrying a warmth that made her breath catch, "having you in my life wouldn't be changing everything. It would be completing everything. I built this place hoping that someday I'd find someone to share it with, someone who could see its possibilities and help me make them real. I never imagined I'd find someone as remarkable as you." The afternoon passed in a blur of conversation and shared discoveries. Daniel showed Sarah his workshop, where he repaired equipment and crafted items needed for ranch work, his hands guiding hers as she felt the quality of his woodworking and metalwork. She examined his account books, impressed by the careful record-keeping that showed a man who understood the business side of ranching as well as the practical aspects. In the garden behind the house, now dormant for winter but still showing signs of careful planning and maintenance, Sarah could envision the growing season that would come with spring. Daniel described the vegetables he raised, the herbs he used for cooking and basic veterinary care, the fruit trees he had planted with an eye toward future harvests. "I'd like to expand the garden," he admitted, Add more variety, maybe try some of the plants that grow well at this altitude, but that I haven't experimented with yet. It would be nice to have someone who understood gardening to help plan and maintain it. Sarah smiled, thinking of the small garden she had tended behind her father's stable years ago. I used to grow herbs and vegetables when I was younger. I think I'd enjoy working with the soil again, learning what grows well in this climate. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Daniel reluctantly began preparations for the return journey to Cedar Falls. Sarah could sense his reluctance to end the day, and she shared his feelings completely. The hours at Meadowbrook Ranch had felt like a glimpse of a life she could not only tolerate, but genuinely love. I hope this day has given you a sense of what life here could be like, Daniel said as he helped her back into the wagon. I know it's a big decision, and I don't want you to feel pressured to make it quickly. Sarah settled onto the wagon seat beside him, her heart full of thoughts and feelings she was still processing. Daniel, I want you to know that this has been one of the most wonderful days I've had since coming to Colorado. Your ranch is everything you said it was and more, and I can see how someone could build a very happy life here. But, Daniel asked, hearing the hesitation in her voice, but I need some time to think about it all, to be sure I'm making the right decision for the right reasons, Sarah said honestly. I made one mistake in judgment when I came to Colorado, and I want to be certain I don't make another. Daniel's response was everything she could have hoped for. Of course you need time to think. This is the most important decision either of us will ever make, and it deserves careful consideration. Take all the time you need, Sarah. I'll be here when you're ready, whatever you decide. The ride back to Cedar Falls was quieter than the morning journey, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with shared contentment rather than awkwardness. Sarah found herself memorizing the sounds and scents of the route, imagining what it would be like to make this journey regularly as a resident of Meadowbrook Ranch rather than a visitor. As they reached the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Daniel spoke again. Sarah, regardless of what you decide about the ranch, I want you to know that meeting you has changed my life. You've shown me what real partnership could look like, what it means to have someone who sees possibilities instead of limitations. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his voice. You've changed my life too, Daniel. You've shown me that there are still good men in the world, men who can see past surface differences to what really matters. When they reached Mrs. Hayes's boarding house, Daniel walked Sarah to the front door with the same careful attention to her comfort that had characterized the entire day. As they stood on the porch saying their goodbyes, he took her hand in both of his. Thank you for today, he said simply. Whatever you decide, I'll always treasure the memory of sharing my home with you. Standing in the darkness of the October evening, surrounded by the familiar sounds of Cedar Falls settling into night, Sarah felt something shift inside her heart. The day at Meadowbrook Ranch had shown her not just what life with Daniel Cooper could be like, but what she herself could become as part of that life. For the first time since losing her sight, she had felt not just accepted, but truly valued for the unique perspective and abilities she brought to a partnership. As she made her way up to her room, Sarah's mind was already working through the practical considerations of the decision she was beginning to realize she had already made. Tomorrow, she would speak with Martha Fletcher about her future at the store, with Dr. Walsh about her medical training, and with Mrs. Hayes about the logistics of changing her living arrangements. But tonight, she allowed herself to dream about spring mornings at Meadowbrook Ranch, about the garden she would plant and tend, about the life she could build with a man who had learned to see the world through her eyes, just as she was learning to see it through his. The first snowfall of the season arrived 3 days after Sarah's visit to Meadowbrook Ranch, blanketing Cedar Falls in a pristine white silence that muffled sound and transformed the familiar town into something magical and new. Sarah woke to the particular quiet that comes with fresh snow, a hushed quality to the air that she had learned to recognize from her childhood winters in Illinois. Standing at her window in the boarding house, she could feel the cold radiating through the glass and hear the soft whisper of flakes still falling. The snow brought with it a sense of urgency, a reminder that winter in the Colorado mountains was not a season to be taken lightly. Decisions that could be postponed during the gentle days of autumn became pressing matters when the thermometer dropped and the roads became treacherous. Mrs. Hayes confirmed Sarah's weather assessment when she came down to breakfast. "Looks like winter's decided to announce itself early this year," the older woman observed, setting a plate of hotcakes and bacon before Sarah. "We'll likely have this snow on the ground until spring now. The mountain passes will be closing soon, if they haven't already." The implication hung in the air between them. If Sarah was going to make any major changes to her living situation, she needed to do so before the weather made travel between town and outlying ranches difficult or impossible. The window of opportunity that had seemed comfortably wide just a few days ago was rapidly narrowing. At Fletcher's General Store, Martha Fletcher was dealing with the familiar rush of customers stocking up on supplies before the winter weather settled in for good. Sarah found herself busier than usual with last-minute mending jobs as people brought in work they had been putting off throughout the autumn months. "Funny how a little snow makes people realize what needs doing," Martha commented as she tallied up another customer's purchases. "Same thing happens every year, as if winter comes as a complete surprise instead of showing up right on schedule." Sarah smiled as she worked on reinforcing the seams of a heavy coat that would need to last its owner through the long months ahead. There was something comforting about the rhythm of preparing for winter, the sense of community that came from everyone working together to ensure they would all be safe and comfortable during the harsh season. It was while she was absorbed in this work that she heard the familiar jingle of the store's bell and the sound of boots stamping snow off on the entrance mat. The voice that called out a greeting to Martha Fletcher made Sarah's pulse quicken with recognition and something deeper that she was finally ready to acknowledge as love. "Afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher. I was hoping Sarah might be available to speak with me for a few minutes." Daniel Cooper's voice carried the same warmth that had characterized their day at his ranch, but Sarah could hear an underlying tension that suggested he had something important on his mind. She set down her needlework and rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt and trying to calm her suddenly racing heart. "Of course, Mr. Cooper, what can I do for you?" "I was wondering if you might join me for a walk, if the weather isn't too harsh for you. I have something I'd like to discuss, and I thought you might prefer privacy for the conversation." Martha Fletcher's knowing chuckle filled the brief silence that followed. "Go on, Sarah. I can manage things here for a while. Take your warm cloak, though. This snow's got teeth in it." Wrapped in Mrs. Hayes's borrowed cloak and with Daniel's steady arm to guide her, Sarah stepped out into the winter wonderland that Cedar Falls had become. The snow crunched pleasantly under their feet as they walked slowly down Main Street, Daniel describing the transformed landscape while keeping careful watch for patches of ice that might pose a hazard. "The whole town looks like something from a fairy tale," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Every building outlined in white, icicles hanging from the eaves like crystal decorations. It's beautiful. But it's also a reminder that winter doesn't wait for anyone's convenience." They had walked nearly to the end of Main Street before Daniel broached the subject that had brought him to town. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, about giving you time." To make your decision, I want you to know that I meant every word of that, and I don't want you to feel rushed or pressured." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to come. "But this snow changes things," Daniel continued. "If you decided you wanted to spend the winter at the ranch to really experience what life there would be like through all the seasons, you'd need to make that decision soon. Another day or two of this weather, and the roads will be too dangerous for regular travel." The offer hung between them, like the snowflakes drifting through the air, beautiful and ephemeral, and requiring an immediate response. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she considered the implications of what Daniel was suggesting. To spend the winter at Meadowbrook Ranch would be to commit to far more than a visit. It would be a declaration of intent, a step toward the life she had glimpsed during her Sunday afternoon at his home. "Daniel," she said carefully, "are you asking me to come to your ranch as a guest for the winter? Or are you asking me something more permanent?" Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her, his gloved hands reaching for hers. "Sarah Mitchell, I'm asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to become my wife and my partner in every sense of the word, to help me build something beautiful and lasting at Meadowbrook Ranch." The words she had been both hoping for and fearing hung in the cold air between them. Sarah felt tears beginning to freeze on her cheeks as she struggled to process the magnitude of what Daniel was offering her. This was the proposal she had traveled to Colorado hoping to receive, but it was coming from a completely different man, under completely different circumstances than she had ever imagined. "I know this is sudden," Daniel continued, his voice gentle but urgent. "I know we haven't known each other long, and I know you have every reason to be cautious after what happened with Thomas Garrett. But Sarah, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I love your strength and your courage and your determination to make a place for yourself in the world, despite every obstacle that's been put in your path." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You love me." "I love everything about you," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love the way you listen to the world around you with such attention and understanding. I love the way you've made a home for yourself in Cedar Falls, through nothing but hard work and refusal to give up. I love the way you see possibilities where other people see problems. I love the woman you are, Sarah, not despite your blindness, but including it as part of what makes you remarkable." The tears were flowing freely now, and Sarah made no attempt to stop them. "Daniel, I love you too. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you helped me with that horse, but I was so afraid of making another mistake, of trusting my heart when it had led me astray before." Daniel's arms came around her then, holding her close, while the snow continued to fall around them like a blessing. "Your heart didn't lead you astray, Sarah. It brought you to Colorado, and eventually it brought you to me. Sometimes we have to travel through disappointment to find what we're really looking for." Standing in Daniel Cooper's embrace, while snow fell on the streets of Cedar Falls, Sarah felt the last of her reservations melt away like ice in spring sunshine. This was the moment she had been moving toward since the day she stepped off the train, not the moment with Thomas Garrett that had ended in rejection and heartbreak, but this moment when she found herself truly seen and valued and loved by a man worthy of her affection in return. "Yes," she whispered against his chest, "yes, I'll marry you. I'll come to the ranch and help you build the life we both want." Daniel's joyful laugh echoed off the snow-covered buildings as he lifted Sarah off her feet and spun her around in the falling snow. "We'll be married as soon as Pastor Brooks can perform the ceremony," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "And then we'll spend the winter learning everything about each other that we haven't discovered yet." The practical arrangements for their wedding fell into place with surprising ease. Pastor Brooks was delighted to perform the ceremony and declared that the following Sunday would be perfect for a wedding if the couple was amenable to a simple service in the small church. Mrs. Hayes immediately began planning a wedding breakfast to follow the ceremony, and Martha Fletcher insisted on closing the store for the afternoon so that the whole town could celebrate. Dr. Walsh, when informed of Sarah's impending marriage and move to the ranch, expressed his regret at losing her assistance, but also his pleasure at seeing her find happiness. "You'll be missed in town," he told her, "but I have a feeling Daniel Cooper is getting the better part of this bargain. You take care of yourself out there, and don't hesitate to send word if you need anything." The days between Daniel's proposal and their wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation and excitement. Sarah packed her few belongings, said goodbye to the people who had become her friends and supporters during her time in Cedar Falls, and tried to absorb the reality that she was about to become Sarah Cooper, wife of a Colorado rancher and partner, in building a life she had only dreamed of months before. Martha Fletcher surprised her with a wedding gift that brought tears to her eyes, a sewing basket filled with the finest threads and fabrics available in the store. "For when you want to make something beautiful," Martha said simply. "Every woman needs the tools to create beauty in her home." Mrs. Hayes's gift was more practical but equally thoughtful, a collection of recipes that had been tested in mountain kitchens and proven successful at high altitude. "Cooking's different up here," she explained. "These will help you avoid some of the disasters that plague newcomers to mountain cooking." On the morning of her wedding, Sarah woke to brilliant sunshine and air so cold and clear it seemed to ring like crystal when she breathed. Mrs. Hayes had prepared a special breakfast of her famous cinnamon rolls and coffee rich enough to warm the soul, and the two women sat together in comfortable companionship as Sarah prepared for the most important day of her life. "Are you nervous?" Mrs. Hayes asked as she helped Sarah arrange her hair in an elaborate style befitting a bride. "Terrified," Sarah admitted with a laugh, "but it's a good kind of terrified, if that makes sense. I'm afraid of how much I want this, how much it will mean if it works out well." "Honey, terror's just excitement wearing different clothes," Mrs. Hayes said wisely. "The important thing is that you're marrying a man who sees you clearly and loves what he sees. That's rarer than you might think, and it's worth any amount of nervousness." The dress Sarah wore to her wedding was one she had sewn herself during the long evenings between Daniel's proposal and the ceremony. Made of deep blue wool that complemented her eyes and trimmed with delicate white lace she had tatted by hand, it was simple but elegant, suitable for both a wedding and the practical life she would be living as a rancher's wife. Daniel waited for her at the altar of Cedar Falls' small church, dressed in his best suit and looking more handsome than Sarah had ever imagined him. She could hear the smile in his voice as he spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish her, to be her partner in all things, and to see the world through her eyes when her own sight failed her. Sarah's own vows were equally heartfelt, her voice steady and clear as she promised to stand by Daniel through all the challenges and joys that lay ahead, to help him build the life they both envisioned, and to trust in the love that had brought them together, despite all the obstacles that had stood in their path. When Pastor Brooks pronounced them husband and wife, and Daniel lifted Sarah's veil to kiss her for the first time as her husband, the small church erupted in applause and cheers from the assembled townspeople. Sarah had never felt more beautiful or more beloved than she did in that moment, surrounded by friends who had watched her journey from rejected mail-order bride to cherished wife. The wedding breakfast at Mrs. Hayes's boarding house was a joyful affair, with the entire population of Cedar Falls seeming to crowd into the dining room to celebrate the newlyweds. Toasts were offered, stories were shared, and Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance of the community she was leaving behind. "You'll always have a home here if you need one," Martha Fletcher told her as the celebration began to wind down. "But something tells me you won't be needing it. That husband of yours looks at you like you hung the moon and stars." As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Daniel helped Sarah into the wagon that would carry them to Meadowbrook Ranch and the beginning of their married life together. The wagon bed was packed with wedding gifts from the townspeople, everything from quilts and cooking pots to books and gardening tools, evidence of the affection and good wishes that followed them from Cedar Falls. The ride to the ranch was magical in the crisp winter air, with Daniel describing the snow-covered landscape in the vivid detail that had become his special gift to Sarah. He told her about the way the setting sun turned the snow-covered peaks pink and gold, about the patterns of animal tracks that crisscrossed, the white fields, about the smoke rising from the chimney of their home that promised warmth and comfort at the end of their journey. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cooper," Daniel said, as he helped Sarah down from the wagon at Meadowbrook Ranch. The title sounded strange and wonderful in her ears, a symbol of the new identity she was embracing as Daniel's wife and partner. The house had been transformed in preparation for Sarah's arrival. Daniel had spent the week since their engagement making subtle modifications to improve accessibility and comfort for his blind bride. Furniture had been arranged to create clear pathways. Kitchen items had been organized in logical patterns that Sarah could memorize, and he had even installed a rope along the path from the house to the barn to serve as a guide during winter storms. "I want you to feel safe and confident here," he explained as he showed her the changes. "This is your home now, and I want you to be able to move through it with complete independence." That night, as they sat before the fireplace in their front room, sharing their first evening as husband and wife, Sarah felt a contentment she had never experienced before. The house was warm, despite the cold wind that howled around the eaves. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities, and beside her sat the man who had seen past her limitations to the woman she truly was. "Do you have any regrets?" Daniel asked softly, his arm around Sarah as she leaned against his shoulder. Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain of Thomas Garrett's rejection, but I can't regret the experience itself. If he had accepted me, I never would have found you. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us leads directly to the best thing." Daniel's kiss was soft and full of promise. "I love you, Sarah Cooper, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you made the right choice in trusting me." Spring arrived at Meadowbrook Ranch with the sound of rushing water as snow melted from the mountainsides and filled the creek that ran through Daniel and Sarah's property. Sarah woke each morning to birdsong she was learning to identify, the cheerful twitter of mountain bluebirds and the more raucous calls of magpies that had taken up residence in the tall pines surrounding their home. The harsh winter that had tested their new marriage was finally releasing its grip on the land, revealing the promise of new growth and fresh beginnings. The months of winter isolation had been a blessing in disguise, giving Daniel and Sarah the time and space to truly learn each other without the distractions of social obligations or outside interference. They had discovered rhythms of daily life that suited them both, with Sarah taking charge of the household management while Daniel handled the livestock and outdoor maintenance that kept the ranch functioning smoothly. Sarah had proven herself remarkably adaptable to ranch life, quickly mastering the routines of caring for chickens, managing the dairy cow that provided their milk and butter, and maintaining the large garden plot that would feed them through another winter. Her enhanced senses had proven invaluable in ways neither of them had anticipated. She could detect illness in the animals by changes in their breathing or movement patterns days before Daniel's eyes would have noticed anything amiss. Her acute hearing allowed her to monitor the sounds of the ranch, even from inside the house, alerting them to potential problems with the livestock or approaching weather changes. The kitchen had become Sarah's domain in the truest sense, organized. According to her own system and stocked with ingredients she had learned to identify by scent, texture, and taste. Daniel delighted in her cooking, which had improved dramatically as she adapted her techniques to the challenges of high altitude, baking and the ingredients available on an isolated ranch. She had mastered the art of bread that rose properly in the thin mountain air, learned to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter months, and created meals that transformed simple ingredients into feasts worthy of celebration. On this particular morning in late April, Sarah stood in her kitchen preparing breakfast while listening to Daniel in the barn, attending to the morning milking. The familiar sounds of his voice speaking gently to the animals and the rhythmic splash of milk hitting the pail were as comforting to her as a lullaby. These were the sounds of home, of a life built together through shared work and mutual respect. The letter that would change everything arrived with the weekly mail delivery, carried by Tom Henderson, who made the circuit between Cedar Falls and the outlying ranches whenever weather permitted. Sarah heard his approach long before Daniel emerged from the barn to greet him. The distinctive sound of his horse's hoofbeats and the jingle of the mailbag announcing his arrival. "Morning, Mrs. Cooper," Tom called out cheerfully as he dismounted. "Near the front porch. Got a letter here for you folks. Looks like it might be important. Return address. Says it's from some lawyer in Boston." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat at the mention of Boston. She had left no unfinished business in Massachusetts, had severed all connections with her former life when she made the decision to stay in Colorado. The arrival of legal correspondence from her past felt ominous, a reminder of complications she had thought were behind her forever. Daniel accepted the letter with thanks and a cup of coffee for Tom, who lingered long enough to share the latest news from town before continuing on his route. When they were alone again, Daniel brought the envelope to Sarah, describing its official appearance and the formal script of the return address. "Whitmore, Harrison and Associates, Attorneys at Law," he read. "Should I open it, or would you prefer to handle it yourself?" Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope, running her fingers over the raised lettering of the law firm's name. "I think I'd better read it myself. I can't imagine what legal matter could involve me, but it's obviously something that requires my attention." The letter was written in the careful script that legal clerks used for formal correspondence, and Sarah's fingers traced each word as she read the contents aloud. What she discovered left her speechless with shock and disbelief. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell Cooper," she read, her voice growing steadier as she processed the incredible news. "We are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the last will and testament of Miss Cordelia Matthews, deceased. Miss Matthews was your maternal grandmother's sister, and though you may not have been personally acquainted, she followed your circumstances with great interest through correspondence. With mutual acquaintances." Daniel moved closer as Sarah continued reading, his presence a steady comfort as the implications of the letter began to sink in. "Miss Matthews passed away peacefully in her sleep last month at the age of 87. Her estate consists primarily of a fully paid property in the town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, which she purchased through correspondence after learning of your residence in that area. The property includes a 2-story brick building, currently leased to medical professionals, generating monthly rental income of approximately $100. Sarah's voice faltered as she read the final paragraph. "We understand that you are currently residing at Meadowbrook Ranch with your husband, Mr. Daniel Cooper." Should you wish to claim your inheritance, please contact our offices at your earliest convenience to arrange for the transfer of the property deed and associated documents. Our congratulations on your recent marriage and our condolences on the loss of your great-aunt, who spoke often of her admiration for your courage and independence. The letter fluttered from Sarah's fingers as she sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had inherited property in Cedar Falls, property that generated enough income to ensure her financial independence for the rest of her life. The great-aunt she had never met had somehow learned of her circumstances and chosen to provide for her future in a way that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Daniel retrieved the letter from the floor and read through it again carefully, making sure they had understood the details correctly. Sarah, do you realize what this means? You own a building in Cedar Falls, a building that's generating income. You're financially independent. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Sarah was still struggling to process. Financial independence had been a dream so distant that she had barely allowed herself to imagine it. Now, through the generosity of a relative she had never known existed, that dream had become reality. "I don't understand," Sarah said slowly. "How did this Cordelia Matthews even know about me? I've never heard her name mentioned by anyone in my family." Daniel sat beside her on their kitchen bench, taking her hands in his. "Does it matter how she knew? What matters is that she cared enough to provide for your future, to make sure you would never have to depend on anyone else's charity or goodwill." The truth of his words struck Sarah with sudden clarity. For the first time in her adult life, she was truly free to make choices based on her own desires rather than economic necessity. She could continue her marriage to Daniel because she loved him and wanted to share his life, not because she needed his protection and support. The inheritance had given her something more precious than money. It had given her the freedom to choose her own path. "Daniel," she said carefully, "this changes things between us. I want you to know that staying here, being your wife, that's my choice now. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Daniel's arms came around her, holding her close as he absorbed the full meaning of her words. "Sarah, that's all I've ever wanted, for you to be here because you choose to be, not because circumstances forced you to be." The implications of the inheritance extended beyond their personal relationship. Sarah began to see possibilities for how the property in Cedar Falls could benefit not just herself, but the entire community. Dr. Walsh had often mentioned the need for better medical facilities, and the rental income from her building could support improvements to healthcare in the area. Over the following days, Sarah and Daniel discussed the inheritance at length, exploring all the options available to them. They could sell the property and invest the proceeds in expanding Meadowbrook Ranch. They could maintain it as rental property and use the income to improve their own circumstances. Or they could find ways to use Sarah's new resources to benefit the community that had welcomed her and supported her during her time of greatest need. It was Sarah who suggested the solution that seemed to satisfy all their goals. What if we kept the property but used part of the income to establish a medical clinic in Cedar Falls? Dr. Walsh could have proper facilities for treating serious injuries and illnesses, and we could hire a nurse to assist him. The rest of the income could support our ranch and our future. Daniel's enthusiasm for the idea was immediate and wholehearted. "That's brilliant, Sarah. You'd be giving back to the community that gave you a home when you needed one, and at the same time building something that would benefit everyone in the area." The trip to Cedar Falls to finalize the inheritance and explore the possibilities for the medical clinic was Sarah's first return to town since her wedding 6 months earlier. The warm welcome she received from friends and neighbors reminded her of how much she had gained by choosing to stay in Colorado, despite Thomas Garrett's initial rejection. Martha Fletcher greeted her with tears of joy and a long embrace. "Look, at you, married life agrees with you completely. You're glowing with happiness, and I can see why. That husband of yours looks at you like you're the most precious thing in his world." Dr. Walsh was overwhelmed by Sarah's proposal to establish a proper medical clinic using the income from her inherited property. "My dear young woman, this is beyond generous. A real clinic with proper equipment and a trained nurse would transform the level of care I can provide to this community." The inherited building proved to be even more valuable than the letter had indicated. Located on Main Street in the heart of Cedar Falls, it was a substantial brick structure with large windows and multiple rooms that could easily be converted to medical use. The current tenants, a law office and an accounting firm, were happy to relocate to smaller quarters when they learned of the planned medical clinic. Mrs. Hayes insisted on hosting a dinner party to celebrate Sarah's good fortune and to discuss the plans for the clinic. The gathering included all the people who had become important to Sarah during her time in Cedar Falls, and their enthusiasm for the project was infectious. "This clinic will serve people from ranches and mining camps for 50 miles around," Pastor Brooks observed. "You're not just helping Cedar Falls, Sarah, you're helping the entire region." As spring progressed into summer, work began on converting Sarah's building into a medical facility. Sarah threw herself into the project with enthusiasm, using her inheritance income to purchase the latest medical equipment and to hire a qualified nurse from Denver who was eager to work in the mountains. The grand opening of the Cedar Falls Medical Clinic took place on a bright day in early July, with half the population of the county turning out to tour the new facilities and celebrate the achievement. Sarah cut the ribbon with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the knowledge that her great-aunt's generosity had made possible something that would benefit generations of Colorado residents. Dr. Walsh gave a speech thanking Sarah for her vision and generosity, but it was Daniel's words that moved her most deeply. "My wife has shown all of us what it means to turn personal blessing into community benefit," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "She came to Colorado as a stranger seeking a new life, and she has given us all a gift that will improve our lives for years to come." That evening, as Sarah and Daniel sat on their front porch at Meadowbrook Ranch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rejection by Thomas Garrett that had seemed like the end of her dreams had actually been the beginning of a life better than anything she had dared to imagine. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Thomas Garrett had accepted you?" Daniel asked, as if reading her thoughts. Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "I think I would have been adequate as his wife, but I never would have been happy. He wanted someone to fit into his existing life, not someone to build a new life with. With you, I've become more than I ever thought I could be." Daniel took her hand, threading their fingers together as they had done countless times during their months of marriage. "You've made me more than I thought I could be too. This ranch, this life, it's everything I hoped for when I came to Colorado, but having you to share it with has made it something I never could have imagined." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a deep contentment settle over her. The inheritance from Cordelia Matthews had given her financial independence, but more importantly, it had given her the freedom to choose her life based on love rather than necessity. The medical clinic would serve the community for decades to come, a lasting legacy of the generosity that had changed her circumstances so dramatically. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "What would you think about adding to our family? I mean, if we're going to build something lasting here, shouldn't we think about children to carry it forward? Daniel's sharp intake of breath told her that the thought had occurred to him as, "Well, I've been hoping you might want that someday. Children who could grow up knowing this land, who could see the beauty of these mountains and understand what it means to build something with their own hands." Sarah smiled, imagining the sounds of children's laughter echoing through the rooms of their home, the patter of small feet on the wooden floors, the joy of teaching young minds about the world through senses other than sight. "I think children raised here would understand that there are many ways to see the world, many ways to find beauty and meaning in life." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, a shooting star streaked across the sky above them. Daniel described its path in the vivid detail that had become his special gift to Sarah, painting a picture of light and motion that she could see clearly in her mind's eye. "I used to think that losing my sight was the worst thing that could happen to me," Sarah said softly. "Now I understand that it was just preparation for finding you, for finding this life. I see more clearly now than I ever did when I had my physical sight." Daniel's kiss was gentle and full of promise. "You've taught me to see too, Sarah, to see what really matters, what's truly beautiful, what makes life worth living." The months that followed brought changes and growth to Meadowbrook Ranch and to the community of Cedar Falls. The medical clinic flourished under Dr. Walsh's direction, serving not just the immediate area, but drawing patients from throughout the region. Sarah's inheritance continued to provide steady income that supported both the clinic and improvements to the ranch. By the time the first anniversary of their wedding arrived, Sarah was expecting their first child, a development that filled both her and Daniel with joy and anticipation. The baby would be born in spring, bringing new life to Meadowbrook Ranch, just as the land itself awakened from winter's sleep. "This child will never know a world where mama's blindness is seen as a limitation," Daniel said one evening as they planned the nursery. "They'll grow up understanding that there are different ways of experiencing life, all of them valid and valuable." Sarah placed her hands on her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement that promised the future they were building together. "Our children will know that love sees more clearly than eyes ever could, that the heart recognizes what truly matters, even when the eyes cannot." On a warm spring morning exactly 1 year after their wedding, Sarah gave birth to their daughter, Emma, with Dr. Walsh and the clinic nurse attending the delivery at Meadowbrook Ranch. The baby's first cries echoed through the house that Daniel had built with hopes of filling it with family, and Sarah wept with joy as she held her daughter for the first time. "She's perfect," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She has your nose and your stubborn chin, and I think she's going to have your determination too." As Sarah cradled her newborn daughter, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect happiness. The mail-order bride, who had been rejected for her blindness, had found something infinitely more valuable than the acceptance she had originally sought. She had found true love, meaningful work, financial independence, and now the blessing of motherhood. Emma grew into a bright, curious child who learned to navigate the world through all her senses, guided by a mother who understood that limitations existed only in the minds of those who imposed them. She would race through the meadows of Meadowbrook Ranch with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged, who understood that home was built not just with lumber and nails, but with love and acceptance and the daily choice to build something beautiful together. Years later, when visitors to Cedar Falls asked about the medical clinic and the story behind its establishment, they would hear the tale of Sarah Cooper, the blind woman who had turned personal tragedy into community triumph. But those who knew Sarah best understood that her greatest achievement was not the clinic or the inheritance or even the successful ranch she had helped build. Her greatest achievement was the life she had created through the simple but revolutionary act of refusing to accept others' definitions of what she could or could not do. She had arrived in Colorado as a rejected mail-order bride, dismissed by a man who could not see past her blindness to the woman beneath. She had transformed herself into a beloved wife, successful businesswoman, community benefactor, and devoted mother, proving that the only limitations that truly mattered were the ones people accepted for themselves. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the family was gathered around their fireplace, Sarah would sometimes think about the letter that had started it all. Thomas Garrett's correspondence that had seemed to promise so much and had delivered so little. She felt no bitterness toward him anymore, only gratitude for the rejection that had forced her to find her own path to happiness. Daniel had indeed become her eyes, but more than that, he had helped her see herself clearly for the first time. Through his love and respect, she had learned that she was not a woman who happened to be blind, but a complete person whose blindness was simply one aspect of a rich and complex identity. Their love story had begun with rejection and loss, but it had grown into something that would endure for generations, a testament to the power of seeing beyond surface appearances to the heart of what truly mattered. In a world that often valued only what was visible and conventional, Sarah and Daniel had built something extraordinary through the simple act of looking deeper, of choosing to see with the heart rather than the eyes. The mail-order bride, who had been rejected for being blind, had found not just acceptance but celebration, not just tolerance but deep and abiding love. She had discovered that the greatest vision was not the ability to see the world around her, but the wisdom to recognize love when it appeared, disguised sometimes as the very trials that seemed designed to break her spirit. In the end, Sarah Cooper's story was not about overcoming blindness, but about opening the eyes of everyone around her to new possibilities, new definitions of worth and beauty and success. She had arrived in Colorado seeking a husband and had found instead a calling, a community, and a love that would light the way for everyone fortunate enough to know her. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.